At my sister's engagement dinner, I walked around the elegantly decorated tables looking for a place card with my name. There was none. My sister tapped her champagne glass, smiled into the microphone, and told 50 guests that she did not think her failure of an older sister would actually show up. She pointed toward the back of the room and told me to sit at the bar so I would not ruin the aesthetic of her high-class photos. I did not cry. I simply took my girlfriend by the hand, walked to the bar, and ordered a martini. It drove my sister absolutely crazy that I did not break down. And when the $2,800 bill arrived later that night, my family learned exactly who they had just humiliated. My name is Amelia, 33 years old, and despite being written off by my own parents as the ultimate disappointment, I am now the managing partner of a venture capital firm with hundreds of millions of dollars under management. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who underestimated your worth. The evening began at El Ora, one of the most exclusive and expensive restaurants in the city. It was the kind of place that required reservations months in advance and enforced a strict black-tie dress code. I wore a tailored charcoal pantsuit, and my girlfriend Isabella looked absolutely breathtaking beside me in a sleek emerald gown. Isabella is 34, razor sharp, and comes from a family with generational wealth, though you would never guess it from her grounded personality. She held my hand as we walked into the private dining room that my parents had supposedly rented for the occasion. 50 guests were already mingling under the glittering crystal chandeliers. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated with trays of champagne and caviar. I walked toward the main family table near the front. My parents Richard and Patricia were already seated. They were chatting animatedly with the parents of my sister's fiancé, completely ignoring my arrival. I scanned the elegant gold foil place cards. There was a card for my mother, a card for my father, a card for my aunt. I checked the adjacent tables. Nothing. I checked the tables in the back near the kitchen doors. Still nothing. My name simply did not exist in this room. Isabella squeezed my hand, her eyes narrowing as she realized what was happening. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest. For a split second, the old childhood insecurities threatened to surface. The feeling of being the unwanted daughter, the outcast, the one who never quite fit into my parents' perfect suburban image. Before I could ask a waiter for assistance, the clinking of a spoon against crystal echoed through the room. My younger sister Madison, 29 years old and glowing in a designer cocktail dress, stood at the front of the room holding a microphone. Beside her stood Kendrick, her 32-year-old African-American fiancé. Kendrick was a tech bro who had recently launched a financial technology startup. He wore a custom suit and a smug smile, clearly reveling in the attention and the illusion of wealth my family was projecting. Madison beamed at the crowd, welcoming everyone to the celebration. Then her eyes found me standing awkwardly near the center of the room. Her smile turned sharp. "Well," Madison said, her voice amplified for all 50 guests to hear. "It looks like we have an unexpected arrival. I honestly did not think my older sister would actually show up tonight. I mean, given her track record of dropping out of things, I figured she would skip this too." A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the crowd. My mother looked down at her plate, pretending not to notice. My father took a sip of his wine, his face completely passive. Madison continued, gesturing vaguely toward the back of the room. "Amelia, since we did not plan for you to be here, there is no seat for you at the family tables. We are keeping the front area reserved for close family and Kendrick's investors. We really need the aesthetic to be perfect for the photographer. Why do you not head over to the bar in the back? I'm sure they can find a stool for you there." The room fell completely silent. Every single eye turned to look at me. In the past, this would have crushed me. I would have run to the bathroom in tears or stormed out of the restaurant, giving my parents another reason to call me unstable and dramatic. That was exactly what Madison wanted. She wanted a scene. She wanted to prove to her wealthy new fiancé that she was the superior sister, and I was just the tragic, embarrassing relative. Instead of giving her that satisfaction, I felt a cool, deep calm wash over me. I looked at Madison, then at my parents who refused to meet my gaze. I did not shed a single tear. I just smiled a slow, knowing smile that made Madison's confident expression falter for a fraction of a second. I turned to Isabella. Her jaw was clenched, her eyes flashing with a protective anger that made me love her even more. "Let us go get a drink," I whispered to her. With perfect posture and total grace, we walked away from the silent crowd and took 2 seats at the dark mahogany bar at the far end of the room. The bartender, looking incredibly uncomfortable, handed us menus. I ordered 2 premium martinis, leaning back in my leather chair, as if I had just secured the best seat in the house. From across the room, I could see Madison glaring at me. My complete lack of a breakdown was driving her crazy. She hurriedly whispered something to Kendrick, clearly agitated that her public execution had failed to produce tears. Isabella took a sip of her drink and let out a low, dry laugh. "I cannot believe they just did that," she said softly. "They really think you are still the broke 20-year-old struggling to pay off debt, do they not? They still think you are just some hourly worker they can step on." I swirled the olive in my glass, watching the bubbles rise. "It is actually hilarious," I replied. "My mother literally stole my identity to take out $45,000 in credit card debt to pay for Madison to study in Europe. I worked 3 jobs to pay off that debt, to save my mother from federal prison. And now they treat me like a beggar, crashing their elite party. Little do they know this whole upper-class image they are projecting to Kendrick is a complete lie." Isabella leaned closer, a dangerous smile playing on her lips. "They are playing a very stupid game, Amelia, especially considering who you are now and considering who I am." I nodded, taking a slow sip of my martini. "Let them play," I said. "The night is still young, and I have a feeling this engagement dinner is going to be unforgettable." The bartender placed our martinis on the polished mahogany counter with a quiet nod before retreating to the other side of the room. Isabella traced the rim of her glass with one perfectly manicured finger. Her sharp emerald eyes remained fixed on the spectacle unfolding at the main tables. She leaned in close to me, the faint scent of her expensive perfume cutting through the heavy air of the restaurant. Her voice was a smooth and dangerous whisper. "Do they seriously still think you are the exhausted waitress from 5 years ago? Do they have any idea who is actually sitting in this room right now?" I took a slow sip of my drink, letting the icy gin burn the back of my throat. I did not feel sad. I did not feel betrayed or heartbroken. I just felt a profound and freezing clarity. "No," I replied, keeping my gaze steady on my parents across the crowded room. "To them, I am still the ultimate scapegoat. I am still the naive girl they bled dry to fund Madison and her perfect life. My mother and father built this entire facade of wealth by stepping directly on my neck, and they assume I am still down there on the floor." I told Isabella the details I rarely spoke about. I did not speak with pity or resentment. I spoke with the clinical precision of a venture capitalist evaluating a toxic asset. When I was 20 years old, my mother committed identity theft. She stole my social security number, opened 3 premium credit cards in my name, and maxed them out to the tune of $45,000. Why? Because Madison simply had to do a semester abroad in Europe. Madison needed designer bags to fit in with the wealthy girls at her university. Madison needed luxury weekend trips to the Swiss Alps to post on her social media. And when the collection agencies started calling me, hunting me down for money, I never spent. My parents told me it was my duty as an older sister to absorb the cost. They looked me in the eye and told me I would be ruining the family if I reported the fraud to the police. Isabella's grip on her glass tightened until her knuckles turned a stark white. "And you worked 3 jobs to pay it off," she stated. It was not a question. She already knew the core of my ambition, the intense fire that forged my current success. I nodded slowly, remembering the bone-crushing exhaustion of those years. I scrubbed floors at a diner until 2 in the morning. I tutored college freshmen on my days off. I worked weekend shifts at a miserable call center. I paid back every single cent of that stolen money just to keep my mother out of federal prison. I sacrificed my youth so Madison could sip champagne on a yacht and pretend she was born into old money. They drained me, Isabella. But they did not realize that the intense pressure cooked me into something they can no longer break. I climbed out of those ashes and built an empire while they are still desperately trying to keep up appearances with empty bank accounts. We watched the room from our isolated seats at the bar. Waiters brought out massive platters of lobster tail and prime rib to the main tables. The contrast was laughable. My parents, Richard and Patricia, were laughing loudly, clinging to Kendrick as if he were their golden ticket to the Billionaire Boys Club. Kendrick himself was putting on a ridiculous show. He gestured wildly with his hands, undoubtedly talking about his fintech startup, flashing a Rolex that I knew for a fact was bought on a high-interest credit line. He was a tech bro desperate for validation, and my parents were desperate for a wealthy son-in-law. It was a perfect storm of fake prestige and fragile egos. The dinner service began to wind down. Waiters cleared the expensive china, and guests started to stand up and mingle around the room. Madison, holding a glass of vintage champagne, gathered a group of her bridesmaids and Kendrick's tech friends. I saw her glance in my direction. Her eyes gleamed with raw malice. Instead of ignoring me, she deliberately led her entourage toward the bar area, pretending to show them the architecture of the restaurant. They stopped just a few feet away from where Isabella and I sat. Madison made sure her back was partially to me, but she projected her voice loudly enough for everyone in our radius to hear perfectly. "It is just so exhausting dealing with toxic family members." Madison sighed dramatically, gesturing with her free hand to her friends. "You try to include them, you try to be charitable, and invite them to nice places, but some people just have zero ambition. They just drag the whole vibe down." One of her bridesmaids, a girl dripping in cheap perfume and fake pearls, giggled loudly. "I do not know why you even let her in the building, Madison. If my sister showed up looking like a depressing reminder of the lower class, I would have had security throw her out immediately. She is completely ruining your engagement photos by sitting there looking miserable." Madison tossed her hair back and laughed, a shrill and grating sound that echoed over the soft jazz music playing in the background. "Well, you know my parents. They are just too kind for their own good. They always felt sorry for Amelia. She has been freeloading off our family's generosity for years. I just wish she had the self-awareness to stay away from a high society event like this. It is honestly embarrassing having someone here who cannot even afford to buy her own drinks, let alone contribute a single dollar to a wedding of this caliber." One of Kendrick's friends, another startup founder wearing a suit that was a size too tight, chimed in with a smug grin. "Hey, every rich family has that one relative who peaked in community college and now just waits around for handouts. You just have to cut the dead weight loose, Maddie. You and Kendrick are going to be wealthy beyond belief once his funding comes through. You do not need a waitress sister begging you for rent money." They all laughed together. A chorus of cruel, mocking laughter directed right at my back. Isabella shifted in her seat, her posture turning dangerously predatory. Her eyes narrowed into slits, and she opened her mouth to speak entirely, ready to tear them to shreds and expose exactly who owned the restaurant they were standing in. But I reached out and placed a gentle hand on her knee. I shook my head slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on the mirror behind the bar that reflected Madison's smug face. "Not yet," I whispered softly. "Let them dig their graves a little deeper." I sat at that bar listening to the sister I had bankrupted myself to support call me a freeloader. I listened to people who did not know me mock my financial status and intelligence. They saw a woman sitting quietly in the shadows and assumed I was defeated. They did not see the predator watching its prey. They did not know that tomorrow morning I would be sitting at the head of a massive boardroom table, deciding the absolute fate of the very company Kendrick was using to buy his way into this fake high society. The irony was so delicious I could almost taste it on my tongue. I took another sip of my martini, letting the cold liquid ground me in the present moment. The night was far from over, and my family was about to learn a brutal lesson. The girl they threw to the wolves had not just survived. She had returned as the undisputed leader of the pack. As the evening progressed, the decadent dinner service finally came to a close. The lavish spread of butter, poached lobster tails, truffle-infused risotto, and imported Wagyu steaks had been cleared away by the diligent waitstaff. At the main tables, guests were finishing the last drops of their vintage champagne, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. Isabella and I remained seated at the bar, our untouched second round of martinis resting in front of us. We were simply watching the theater of my family play out. A senior waiter wearing a crisp white shirt and a black vest approached our end of the bar. He carried a sleek black leather folio. He did not look at Isabella. His eyes were fixed entirely on me, and his expression was a mixture of deep discomfort and professional obligation. He stopped right in front of my stool, gently placed the leather folio on the polished mahogany counter, and took a quick step back. I stared at the black folder. I did not need to open it to know what it was, but my curiosity got the better of me. I flipped the leather cover open. Printed neatly at the bottom of the itemized receipt was a staggering total, $2,800. The list above the total was a testament to gluttony. 5 bottles of premium Bordeaux towers of chilled seafood, customized dessert platters. The party had spared absolutely no expense, and they had sent the bill to the woman sitting in the shadows. I slowly raised my head and looked across the expansive dining room. Standing near the entrance of the private event space were my parents, Richard and Patricia. Richard, dressed in a rented tuxedo that fit him just a little too tightly around the waist, caught my eye. He gave a sharp, dismissive flick of his wrist. It was a gesture I knew intimately. It was his universal command to just take care of it. Patricia stood beside him, clutching a designer knockoff purse. She flashed me a tight fake smile, pointed a manicured finger directly at the leather folio, and then gave a sharp nod. The sheer audacity of the gesture hit me like a physical blow, followed immediately by a surge of dark amusement. They had publicly disowned me. They had stolen my identity. They had let my younger sister announce to a room full of strangers that I was an uninvited failure. They had banished me to a bar stool. And yet, when it was time to pay for their luxurious charade, they expected the scapegoat to open her wallet. They honestly believed that because I had worked myself to the bone to pay off the $45,000 debt they fraudulently opened in my name, I was permanently trained to absorb their financial burdens. They thought fear and a desperate need for their approval would force my hand to the credit card in my purse. They were dead wrong. Before I could even reach out to close the folio, Isabella moved. Her hand, adorned with a simple but devastatingly expensive platinum ring, slid smoothly over the bar. She placed her fingertips lightly on the black leather and pushed it deliberately back across the polished wood, stopping it right at the edge of the counter where the waiter stood. Isabella did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her tone was absolute ice, vibrating with the quiet authority of someone who owned the very ground we were sitting on. "We are not on the guest list," Isabella said, her emerald eyes locking onto the nervous waiter. "We did not eat the lobster. We did not drink the Bordeaux. Take this back to the main table. Try the bride." The waiter swallowed hard. He looked from the folio to me to Isabella. Something in Isabella's unwavering gaze commanded total obedience. Without a single word of protest, he picked up the leather folder, bowed his head slightly, and turned around. We watched him walk the long distance back across the restaurant floor, heading directly for the center of the celebration. He approached the main table where Madison was currently leaning against Kendrick, giggling at something one of the tech investors had said. The waiter respectfully cleared his throat and presented the black folio to Madison. From my vantage point at the bar, the visual sequence was absolute perfection. I watched Madison carelessly flip open the cover, expecting to see a complimentary note or perhaps a receipt already settled by her wealthy new fiancé. Instead, her eyes zeroed in on the $2,800 total. The color drained entirely from Madison's face. The giggling stopped instantly. She stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. She snapped her head up and aggressively pointed a finger toward our corner of the room. I could see her mouth moving frantically, demanding to know why the bill had been brought to her table. The waiter stood his ground, shaking his head, and gesturing respectfully back to the bride. The panic at the main table was immediate and contagious. Richard and Patricia noticed the commotion and practically sprinted over to Madison. They hovered over the leather folio, their faces contorting with a mixture of shock and rising fury. Patricia grabbed the bill, her eyes bulging at the total. Richard looked up, his gaze snapping across the room until it locked violently onto me. He was no longer giving dismissive hand gestures. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The illusion of the wealthy, carefree family was instantly shattered by a single piece of paper. Madison forcefully shoved her chair backward. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, a harsh, ugly sound that cut through the refined atmosphere of the restaurant. Several guests turned their heads, their conversations dying out as the tension spiked. Madison grabbed Patricia by the arm, yelled something at Richard, and the three of them began to march. They stomped across the dining room floor, completely abandoning their 50 guests and Kendrick's vital investors. Their pristine posture was gone. They looked like a hunting pack closing in for the kill. They were heading straight for the bar, and the storm was finally about to break. The heavy footsteps of my father echoed against the marble floor, growing louder and faster until he reached the bar. Richard did not say a word at first. He simply grabbed the black leather folio from Madison and slammed it down onto the mahogany counter with such violent force that the liquid in my martini glass violently sloshed over the rim. The sharp cracking sound of the heavy leather hitting the wood echoed through the suddenly quiet restaurant. At the main tables, conversations ground to a halt. Guests turned their heads, their eyes wide, watching the flawless image of my family fracture in real time. "Stop playing these pathetic, childish games right now," Richard hissed, his face inches from mine. His breath smelled of expensive red wine and sheer panic. "You are going to take out your credit card, you are going to pay this bill, and then you are going to walk out the back door before you embarrass us in front of Kendrick and his investors any further." I did not flinch. I did not move a single muscle. I kept my eyes locked on his, watching the vein in his forehead throb. Before I could even form a response, my mother pushed her way past him. Patricia leaned over the bar counter, her manicured fingers gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles turned white. The elegant high society mask she had worn all evening completely melted away, replaced by an ugly twisted snarl of entitlement. "You owe this family, Amelia." Patricia spat, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. Her tone was sharp enough to cut glass. "Do you have any idea what we sacrificed for you? We put a roof over your head for 18 years. We fed you. We clothed you. We gave you a name. You act as if you climbed your way up from nothing, but you forget who gave you the very foundation you stand on. $2,800 is absolutely nothing compared to the debt you owe us for raising you. You are a selfish, ungrateful daughter. Now pay the damn bill and get out of my sight before I have security throw you onto the street." The sheer audacity of her words hung in the air. She was listing basic, fundamental parental obligations, providing food, providing shelter, and weaponizing them as a transactional debt. She actually believed that keeping a child alive was a financial loan that required repayment upon demand. Madison stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with our parents. She crossed her arms tightly across her chest, making sure her massive, undoubtedly financed engagement ring caught the light of the chandeliers above. She looked me up and down with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. "You are just jealous," Madison sneered, her voice carrying a loud, mocking pitch that was definitely designed for the audience of guests watching us from afar. "You have always been jealous of me. Look at you sitting alone at the bar like a stray dog trying to ruin my engagement dinner. You are doing this because you are completely bitter. You are angry because I am marrying a brilliant, successful CEO who is about to secure millions in funding, and you know deep down that no successful, decent man would ever look twice at a washed-up, miserable woman like you." Madison let out a short, cruel laugh, glancing at Isabella, before turning her venom back to me. "You could not land a wealthy husband if your life depended on it, so you sit here seething with envy, trying to punish us for your own pathetic failures. You are a complete joke, Amelia." The air in the restaurant grew incredibly thick. The soft jazz music playing from the overhead speakers seemed to fade into a hollow hum. The bartenders at the other end of the counter had stopped mixing drinks, standing frozen like statues, entirely captivated by the public execution happening in their workspace. The 50 guests at the main tables were no longer pretending to look away. They were openly staring, witnessing the supposed elite family expose their deep, rotting core. I absorbed every single word they threw at me. I absorbed the hatred radiating from my father, the manipulative guilt dripping from my mother, and the vain, shallow cruelty pouring out of my sister. In the past, this coordinated attack would have broken me into pieces. It would have triggered a panic attack, sending me running for the exit in a flood of shameful tears, entirely convinced that I was the villain they painted me to be. But tonight, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, calculating power. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I did not match their frantic, desperate energy. I remained perfectly still on my bar stool. I slowly reached out and wrapped my fingers around the stem of my martini glass. The condensation was cold against my skin. I brought the glass to my lips and took one final, agonizingly slow sip, holding their furious gazes the entire time. I swallowed the gin, savoring the burn. Then, with deliberate and terrifying precision, I lowered the glass. I placed it back onto the cardboard coaster with a soft, definitive click that seemed to echo through the silent room. I placed my hands flat on the mahogany bar, feeling the smooth grain of the wood under my palms. The atmosphere in the restaurant was drawn so tight it felt like a piano string ready to snap. They wanted a submissive, frightened girl who would open her wallet to buy their fleeting approval. They had no idea they had just backed a predator into a corner, and I was finally ready to show them my teeth. I slowly unclasped the small leather clutch resting on the bar. My movements were deliberate and completely unhurried. Richard and Patricia watched me with intense, angry eyes, fully expecting to see a platinum credit card emerge to save them from their financial embarrassment. Madison stood right behind them, a triumphant smirk returning to her face, assuming she had successfully bullied me into submission. Instead of a wallet, I pulled out my phone. I unlocked the screen with a quick swipe and tapped into a secured, encrypted folder I had maintained for over a decade. It was a folder I had hoped I would never have to open in public, but tonight they had practically begged for it. I selected a specific PDF file, a compiled document containing bank statements, credit bureau reports, and a drafted police report that I had ultimately never filed. I looked directly into my mother's eyes. The fake, aggressive confidence she wore was already beginning to fracture under my steady gaze. "You say I owe this family," I said. I did not shout, but I projected my voice from my diaphragm, ensuring that the perfect acoustics of the private dining room carried every single syllable to the silent tables behind them. "You say you put a roof over my head and gave me a foundation." I turned the phone screen around and slid it firmly across the mahogany counter so it stopped mere inches from her trembling manicured fingers. "Are you talking about the debt of raising a child?" I asked, my voice ringing clear and lethal across the room. "Or are you talking about the $45,000 credit card debt where you stole my social security number to secretly open accounts in my name?" Patricia's mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her pale and horrified. I did not let her recover. I raised my voice just enough to guarantee that every investor, every friend, and every future in-law at the main tables heard the exact truth of their pristine family. "Let us talk about what I really owe you, Mother." I continued, my words hitting like physical blows. "Let us talk about how you committed identity theft against your own 20-year-old daughter. Let us talk about how you maxed out 3 separate premium credit cards to fund Madison's luxury semester abroad in Europe. You needed her to have designer bags and ski trips to the Swiss Alps to keep up with the wealthy girls at her university, but you did not have the cash, so you stole my identity to pay for her fake lifestyle." A collective audible gasp rippled through the dining room. I saw a wealthy venture capitalist at the main table physically drop his fork onto his china plate. The clinking sound echoed loudly in the stunned silence. Madison's smug expression evaporated instantly. Her jaw dropped and she looked frantically around the room, realizing that her elite friends and her new fiancé were just told that her glamorous, highly publicized European adventure was funded by felony fraud. The golden child was suddenly exposed as a fraud whose entire life was subsidized by stolen money. "You let me find out through collection agencies," I said, stepping off the bar stool, so I was standing at my full height looking down at my parents. "You let me answer phone calls from debt collectors threatening to ruin my entire financial future before my career even started. And when I confronted you, you cried. You begged on your knees. You told me it was my duty as a sister to let Madison experience the world and that I would destroy the family if I reported it." Richard stood frozen like a statue. His chest heaved, his face cycling through shock, deep humiliation, and a terrifying realization that their carefully constructed high society mask had just been ripped off and shredded in front of Kendrick's investors. He looked over his shoulder, seeing the disgusted whispers of his peers. Guests were leaning in, murmuring behind their hands. The facade of the intellectual, wealthy family was burning to the ground right before his eyes. "I worked 3 jobs to pay off your crime." "Patricia," I stated, stepping closer to the bar. "I scrubbed floors at a diner until 2 in the morning. I tutored freshmen on my days off. I answered phones at a miserable call center until my throat bled. I ate instant noodles and lived in a damp studio apartment for 3 years to pay off your $45,000 theft. I sacrificed my youth to protect this family's precious reputation." I leaned in, dropping my voice to a lethal carrying register. "I paid off every single cent, instead of doing what I should have done, which was turning you over to the authorities and sending you to federal prison for identity theft." Patricia stumbled backward as if I had pushed her. She bumped into Madison, who was staring at the floor, completely unable to meet the eyes of anyone in the room. The upper-class illusion they had spent decades building was dead. Everyone in the restaurant now knew that Patricia was a thief, Richard was a coward who enabled it, and Madison was a parasite who gladly lived off the proceeds of her sister's stolen future. "Do not ever," I said, pointing a finger directly at my mother's chest, "ever tell me that I owe you a single dime. You owe me my 20s. You owe me my peace of mind. You owe me for the blood, sweat, and tears it took to clean up your felony. You are incredibly lucky I am only handing you back a restaurant bill and not a federal subpoena." The silence in the room was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. The heavy, suffocating weight of the truth pinned my family to the floor. They had come to the bar to humiliate a waitress. They had no idea they were stepping into an execution. The silence following my revelation was heavy enough to crush bone. The guests at the nearby tables were completely motionless, their eyes darting between my mother's ashen face and my unwavering stare. Patricia looked as if she might collapse right there on the polished hardwood floor. Richard was breathing heavily, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides, utterly paralyzed by the public exposure of his cowardice. But it was Madison who snapped first. The sheer weight of her humiliation, the realization that her elite friends and her wealthy fiancé had just heard the dirty criminal truth behind her glamorous European semester, finally registered in her brain. Her face flushed a violent mottled red. The veins in her neck strained against her diamond necklace. She could not use words to defend herself because every single word I had spoken was a verifiable fact. So she resorted to the only defense mechanism she had left: pure, unadulterated violence. Madison lunged forward. Her hand shot out and grabbed a half-full crystal goblet of ice water resting on the edge of the bar. With a guttural shriek of pure rage, she raised the heavy glass high above her head, fully intending to hurl the freezing water and heavy ice cubes directly into my face. I did not flinch. I did not raise my arms to protect myself. I simply stared at her, maintaining eye contact, entirely willing to let her commit assault in front of 50 high society witnesses. Beside me, Isabella shifted her weight, her hand hovering just inches from Madison's wrist, ready to intercept the strike with lethal precision. But the glass never came down. A large, immaculately manicured hand wrapped firmly around Madison's wrist mid-air, halting her momentum completely. Kendrick had finally stepped out from the shadows of the main dining area. Madison's 32-year-old African-American fiancé stood tall and imposing, his physical presence instantly commanding the space. He wore a custom-tailored midnight blue Tom Ford suit that screamed new money. Every detail of his appearance, from the perfectly styled fade of his hair to the heavy gold watch gleaming on his wrist, was meticulously curated to project extreme wealth and undeniable success. He gently but firmly pried the crystal glass from Madison's trembling fingers and set it back down on the mahogany counter. He pulled her flush against his chest, playing the role of the calm, protective patriarch, shielding his fragile bride from a chaotic threat. Madison immediately buried her face in his expensive lapel, letting out theatrical, muffled sobs, playing the victim with award-winning dedication. Kendrick did not look at my parents. He fixed his gaze entirely on me. His dark eyes were cold, calculating, and filled with an overwhelming sense of superiority. He looked at me not as a sister-in-law, but as a nuisance, a smudge of dirt on the pristine white canvas of his engagement party. He was acutely aware that his venture capital investors were watching this entire exchange from their tables, and he was determined to handle the situation with the ruthless efficiency of a tech CEO neutralizing a PR disaster. He reached into the inner pocket of his Tom Ford jacket. His movements were slow and deliberate, designed to draw attention. He pulled out a sleek designer leather wallet and extracted a heavy solid metal platinum credit card. The card caught the ambient light of the chandeliers as he held it between his fingers. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the heavy metal card onto the bar counter. It landed right next to the $2,800 leather billing folio with a sharp, authoritative clack. "I will handle this," Kendrick said. His voice was deep, resonant, and entirely devoid of respect. He spoke loudly enough to ensure that the surrounding tables could hear his magnanimous gesture. He wrapped his other arm tighter around Madison, holding her as if protecting her from a disease. He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my simple charcoal pantsuit, clearly assessing my net worth and finding it laughably deficient. He let out a short, condescending exhale, a sound of pure pity mixed with disgust. "I do not want my special day soiled by some lowly wage earner," Kendrick stated, his words dripping with venom. "You come in here uninvited, dressed like a mid-level manager, and you try to ruin Madison's night because you are bitter. You are angry because you are stuck working paycheck to paycheck while she is marrying into a totally different tax bracket. It is pathetic." He leaned forward slightly, resting his hand on the mahogany bar, invading my space with his towering frame. He looked at me with half an eye, utterly dismissive. "Take the card, pay your little family dispute off, and then leave," he ordered. "Go back to whatever cubicle you crawled out of. We are celebrating the future tonight, and you are clearly nothing but a jealous ghost from the past. Do not ever speak to my future wife again." The sheer arrogance radiating from him was almost suffocating. He stood there, chest puffed out, fully convinced that he had just put a desperate, struggling woman in her place. He truly believed his metal credit card and his Tom Ford suit made him an untouchable god in this room. He thought he was the smartest, richest, and most powerful person standing at that bar. Isabella let out a soft, melodic chuckle beside me. She picked up her martini, taking a slow, elegant sip, her eyes dancing with dark amusement. I did not look at the platinum card resting on the counter. I kept my eyes locked on Kendrick. A slow, terrifying smile began to spread across my face. He had no idea what he had just done. He had no idea who he was talking to. He had just handed a loaded gun directly to his executioner. Kendrick left the heavy metal credit card resting on the mahogany surface, his hand casually retreating to adjust the cuffs of his expensive tailored jacket. He looked around the room, making sure the investors at the main tables were watching his display of absolute financial dominance. Satisfied that he had a captive audience, he turned his full attention back to me. He puffed out his chest, completely reveling in the sound of his own voice. "You really have no idea how the real world operates." Amelia Kendrick began, his tone dripping with profound condescension. "You sit here bringing up ancient history and petty family drama because you have absolutely nothing else going for you. People like you always want to drag successful people down to your level. But you see, my world does not operate on petty grievances. My world operates on innovation scaling and massive capital. He took a step closer to the bar, projecting his voice so every single high society guest could hear his triumphant lecture. I am the founder and CEO of a financial technology startup that is about to completely disrupt the digital payment ecosystem. He boasted, a smug, self-satisfied grin spreading across his face. I spend my days flying between Chicago and Silicon Valley, sitting in boardrooms with the most powerful venture capitalists in the country. We are building algorithms and financial infrastructures that you could not even begin to comprehend. We are talking about institutional wealth. We are talking about changing the global market. And what do? You clock into a mundane 9-to-5 job, complain about your childhood, and try to extort a free meal at my engagement party. Kendrick let out a short, mocking laugh, shaking his head, as if he were dealing with a stubborn toddler. You will never even catch a glimpse of the elite circles I operate in, he continued relentlessly. You will never understand the pressure of managing a valuation, or the thrill of securing major institutional backing. You are entirely out of your depth here. Madison is about to become the wife of a major tech founder. She is stepping into a life of absolute luxury, private jets, and exclusive galas. You are just a bitter spectator watching from the cheap seats. So do yourself a favor. Take the charity I just offered you, pay the restaurant, and walk out that door before you embarrass yourself any further. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of his speech hung heavily in the air. He had painted a magnificent portrait of his own imaginary grandeur, entirely convinced that his buzzwords and his metal credit card had thoroughly crushed my spirit. Behind him, Richard seemed to suddenly find his courage. The crushing humiliation of my earlier identity theft revelation was temporarily masked by the blinding glare of his future son-in-law's promised wealth. Richard straightened his rented tuxedo jacket, stepping out from behind Patricia to stand right beside Kendrick. He placed a proud, affirming hand on Kendrick's shoulder, using the younger man as a human shield against the truth. "Listen to him," Amelia Richard commanded, his voice regaining that familiar dictatorial edge I despised so deeply. "This right here is what actual success looks like. This is what happens when you have vision and ambition. Kendrick is building a financial empire, and Madison had the grace and intelligence to align herself with a true winner." Richard looked at Madison, who had finally stopped pretending to cry and was now beaming with vindicated pride. Madison always knew her worth. Richard proclaimed loudly, ensuring the wealthy guests at the back tables heard his proud paternal endorsement. She did not waste her life holding on to bitter resentments. She focused on her future, she networked with the right people, and now she is marrying a man who is about to secure a massive fortune. Kendrick is a golden son-in-law. He is exactly the kind of brilliant, high-caliber man this family deserves. Richard turned his cold, judgmental eyes back to me, pointing a stern finger in my direction. "You should be taking notes instead of throwing tantrums," Richard scolded. "You come in here trying to tear down your own mother and sister because you cannot stand the fact that they have succeeded where you have failed. You are a lonely, miserable woman. Madison is securing a dynasty while you are sitting at a bar relying on a stranger's credit card to pay for a meal you had no right to consume. You are a disgrace to the family name, and you will never ever reach the level of prestige that Kendrick and Madison are stepping into tonight." Patricia nodded vigorously from behind them, a haughty, superior expression returning to her pale face. The three of them stood in a unified front, a wall of pure delusion and staggering arrogance, entirely convinced they had won the battle. They believed they had successfully buried my truth under a mountain of Kendrick's imaginary Silicon Valley gold. I did not interrupt Kendrick's arrogant monologue. I did not yell back at my father's cruel, dismissive insults. I did not even blink. I sat perfectly still on my bar stool, absorbing every single word they threw at me. Slowly, a genuine, radiant smile began to spread across my face. It was not a smile of defense, nor was it a smile of hidden pain. It was the terrifying, quiet smile of a predator watching its prey enthusiastically lock themselves inside a steel cage. I turned my head slightly and looked at Isabella. Isabella was resting her chin elegantly on her hand. Her vibrant emerald eyes danced with a dark, lethal amusement. She looked back at me, reading the absolute lack of mercy in my posture. We did not need to speak a single word to each other. We shared a silent, profound exchange of glances that carried the weight of a loaded weapon. Kendrick had just bragged about pitching to the most powerful venture capitalists in the country. He had just bragged about his financial technology startup, completely unaware that the very woman he was mocking held the absolute power of life and death over his entire company. He had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy him, and he had done it with a proud, booming voice in front of 50 high society witnesses. I looked back at Kendrick, my smile widening into something sharp and dangerous. The trap was set, the audience was waiting, and the execution was about to begin. Kendrick left the heavy metal credit card resting on the mahogany surface, his hand casually retreating to adjust the cuffs of his expensive tailored jacket. He looked around the room, making sure the investors at the main tables were watching his display of absolute financial dominance. Satisfied that he had a captive audience, he turned his full attention back to me. He puffed out his chest, completely reveling in the sound of his own voice. Kendrick's arrogance was suffocating, but to anyone who understood the real business world, it was also incredibly fragile. Startup founders like him always built their entire public identities on a delicate house of cards. They relied heavily on flashy pitch decks, exaggerated user metrics, and the desperate burning hope that some massive venture capital firm would hand them a lifeline before their financial runway hit zero. They projected extreme wealth to hide the terrifying reality that they were one rejected meeting away from total bankruptcy. Isabella understood this ecosystem perfectly. She uncrossed her legs and leaned her elbow gracefully on the polished mahogany bar. The diamonds on her wrist caught the light of the overhead chandeliers, but it was the icy aristocratic authority in her voice that demanded absolute attention. She did not raise her voice above a conversational level. She did not need to. When Isabella spoke, people instinctively listened. "Did you say your company is NovaPay?" Isabella asked. Her tone was casual, polite. Even yet it cut through the heavy, tense atmosphere of the restaurant like a sharpened blade. Kendrick stopped mid-breath. He blinked, clearly thrown off balance by the sudden question from the stunning woman sitting beside me. He puffed his chest out slightly, a patronizing smile returning to his lips. He clearly assumed Isabella was just another high society guest who had been thoroughly impressed by his loud, boastful speech about disrupting global markets. "Yes," Kendrick replied, his voice regaining that slick, practiced arrogance. "NovaPay. We are going to completely redefine peer-to-peer lending and institutional transfers. It is highly disruptive technology. We are the future of finance." Isabella smiled. It was a terrifying, beautiful smile. It was the smile of a predator watching a mouse walk willingly into a steel trap. "Fascinating," Isabella said, her voice dripping with lethal sweetness. "Because I heard through the grapevine that NovaPay is currently burning through cash at a completely unsustainable rate. But more importantly, I heard you have a very specific, highly confidential meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning." Kendrick's confident posture faltered instantly. His eyebrows knitted together in a display of sudden sharp confusion. He looked back at his tech investor friends standing near the main tables, but they were staring right back at him with equally blank, bewildered expressions. He opened his mouth to speak, but Isabella did not give him the chance. She delivered the final devastating blow with the casual elegance of someone discussing the evening weather. "I heard you have a pitching session for your Series A funding round." Isabella continued, her gaze locking onto him like a laser sight. "A $10 million ask, scheduled precisely for 9 in the morning at the executive headquarters of Vanguard Ventures." The color completely drained from Kendrick's face. The smug, untouchable tech CEO facade shattered into a million jagged pieces right there on the restaurant floor. He literally took a physical step backward, his expensive leather shoes squeaking sharply against the polished hardwood. The information Isabella had just casually dropped in the middle of a crowded restaurant bar was highly classified. It was the kind of sensitive corporate data protected by ironclad non-disclosure agreements and strict internal security protocols. No one outside of his core founding team and the top executives at the venture capital firm was supposed to know the exact time, the location, or the specific dollar amount of that critical pitch meeting. It was his absolute last chance to save his sinking company, and a stranger at a bar had just recited his schedule back to him flawlessly. My father, Richard, looked completely lost. He glanced frantically between Kendrick and Isabella, desperately trying to understand how the power dynamic had suddenly flipped in a matter of seconds. Madison clutched Kendrick's arm, sensing the immediate terrifying change in her fiancé's demeanor, but lacking the basic business acumen to comprehend why he looked as though the floor had just opened up beneath him. How Kendrick stammered, the smooth, booming baritone of his voice cracking into a high, panicked pitch. "How could you possibly know my internal schedule?" He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly above the collar of his Tom Ford suit. He was no longer looking at me with pity. He was looking at Isabella with pure, unfiltered terror. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a landmine. "That information is under a strict NDA." Kendrick continued, his voice rising in raw desperation, completely ignoring the whispering crowd around him. "Nobody outside my board of directors knows the exact valuation we are asking for tomorrow. Vanguard Ventures is the most secure firm in the city. How did you get access to my private calendar? Who are you people?" Isabella simply picked up her martini glass and took another slow, deliberate sip. She did not answer him. Her part in this public execution was finished. She had successfully stripped away his expensive armor, exposing the desperate, panicking man beneath the tailored suit. Now it was my turn to deliver the killing strike. The restaurant was dead silent. The 50 guests at the main tables were watching with bated breath, witnessing a massive seismic shift in gravity. The arrogant man who had just thrown a metal credit card at my face and ordered me to leave was now sweating profusely under the glowing lights, waiting for an answer he was not prepared to hear. I took a deep, steadying breath. I placed my hands flat against the cool mahogany surface of the bar. With deliberate, measured movements, I slid off the tall leather bar stool. My heels clicked solidly against the floor as I stood at my full height. I reached up and slowly adjusted the lapels of my tailored charcoal suit jacket. I smoothed out the fabric, making sure every line was perfectly crisp. I squared my shoulders, radiating the kind of absolute, untouchable authority that comes from years of dominating the most ruthless boardrooms in the country. I did not look at my mother. I did not look at my father. I did not even look at Madison. My eyes were fixed entirely on Kendrick. I watched the realization begin to dawn in his panicked eyes. I watched his brain frantically try to connect the dots between the woman his fiancé called a failure and the highly classified financial data that had just been weaponized against him. The trap was permanently sealed. I stood directly in front of him, ready to dismantle his entire life with a single sentence. I closed the final 2 feet of distance between us. Kendrick actually leaned back, his imposing frame suddenly shrinking under the sheer weight of my presence. The restaurant remained entirely soundless. Even the clinking of silverware at the distant tables had ceased. Every breath in the room was held. I kept my voice low, ensuring he had to strain slightly to hear his own execution. "You want to know how we have your highly classified schedule?" I asked, my tone as smooth and cold as polished marble. "You want to know how a stranger at a bar knows the exact valuation of your Series A funding round?" Kendrick nodded once, a jerky, involuntary movement. His throat worked as he swallowed hard. "Because the stranger at the bar is not a stranger at all," I stated clearly. "My name is Amelia. I am the managing partner at Vanguard Ventures." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. I watched Kendrick's eyes widen. I watched the cognitive dissonance violently tear through his mind. "That highly confidential pitch deck you spent the last 6 months agonizing over," I continued relentlessly, "is currently sitting in a sealed folder on my desk. That $10 million lifeline you are desperately praying for requires unanimous board approval. And the woman you just publicly humiliated, the woman you just called a lowly wage earner and told to go back to her cubicle, is the executive who holds the absolute veto power over that entire funding round tomorrow morning. Kendrick let out a sharp, breathless sound. It was half a laugh, half a gasp of pure panic. "No," he stammered, shaking his head rapidly. "No, that is impossible. Madison told me her sister was a waitress. Madison told me you were broke. You are lying. You are just trying to save face." I did not break eye contact. I did not raise my voice to argue. I simply tilted my head and offered a gesture of pure, terrifying invitation. "Look it up," I challenged him. "You have a smartphone in your pocket, Kendrick. Take it out. Go to the Vanguard Ventures official website. Click on the leadership team directory. See for yourself exactly who you just threw a credit card at." His hands were visibly shaking as he reached into the tailored pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a sleek smartphone, his thumbs fumbling over the screen. He nearly dropped the device twice. Beside him, Madison was clutching his arm, her face a mask of absolute bewilderment. She kept asking him what was going on, but he completely ignored her. His entire focus was locked onto the glowing screen in his hands. The silence in the dining room was agonizingly thick. We all stood there, 50 high society guests, watching a man digitally verify his own destruction. I knew exactly what he was looking at. The Vanguard Ventures website was minimalist and intimidating. Under the Executive Leadership tab, my corporate portrait was positioned right at the top. I wore a sharp navy blazer in the photo, my arms crossed, projecting the exact same ruthless authority I was radiating right now. Below the photo, the text was undeniable. Amelia, Managing Partner, Head of Financial Technology Acquisitions. I watched the exact second his eyes found the page. All the blood rushed out of his face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. His jaw slacked. The phone slipped slightly in his sweaty palm. He stared at the digital image, then looked up at my face, then looked back down at the screen. The reality of his colossal, catastrophic mistake crushed him with the force of a freight train. "Oh my God!" Kendrick breathed out the words, barely a whisper. He staggered backward, actually bumping into a nearby cocktail table. The glasses rattled loudly. The arrogant, booming tech founder who had just commanded the room was entirely gone. In his place stood a terrified, desperate man who had just realized he had set fire to his own lifeline. "You are the lead investor," he choked out, looking at me with wide, horrified eyes. "You are the one conducting the final due diligence tomorrow." I gave him a slow, deliberate nod. "Yes, Kendrick. I am the one holding the axe." Madison finally ripped the phone out of his hands. She stared at the screen, her eyes darting back and forth across the text. Her perfectly contoured face twisted into a mask of pure disbelief. She looked from the phone to me, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The narrative she had spun for years. The narrative that I was a failure, a jealous outcast, a pathetic loser, had just been vaporized. My father Richard stepped forward, his face pale and slick with sudden sweat. He tried to read the screen over Madison's shoulder. "What does it say?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "What is going on here?" "Your golden son-in-law." I projected my voice so the entire room could hear the verdict. "Just realized that the broke, pathetic sister he tried to throw out of the restaurant is actually the venture capitalist he has been begging for money for the past 6 months." A shockwave rippled through the crowd. Gasps erupted from the main tables. The investors Kendrick had invited to impress suddenly started whispering furiously to one another. The social hierarchy of the room flipped violently upside down. I looked down at the mahogany bar. The heavy metal platinum card Kendrick had tossed at me earlier was still resting there, gleaming under the chandelier light. I reached out and picked it up. I held the metal card between my index and middle finger, inspecting it with feigned amusement. "You told me to take your charity," I said, my voice echoing in the dead silent room. "You told me you did not want your special day soiled by someone out of your tax bracket." It is incredibly ironic, Kendrick. Because looking at the preliminary financials of your company, I highly doubt this piece of metal will even clear the transaction for the lobster you fed these people tonight. Kendrick lunged forward, his hands raised in a frantic, placating gesture. Amelia, please, he begged, his voice cracking with raw desperation. It was a misunderstanding. I did not know who you were. Madison painted a completely different picture of you. Please, you have to separate family business from professional investments. NovaPay is a solid concept. We need that funding to survive the quarter. I held up my hand, stopping his pathetic rambling instantly. I let the silence stretch, letting him marinate in his own spectacular failure. He had built his entire ego on disrespecting anyone he deemed beneath him, and now he was begging for mercy from the very woman he had tried to step on. The dynamic was completely broken, and I was holding the sledgehammer. Kendrick tried to salvage the unsalvageable. I watched his brain frantically misfire as he searched for an exit strategy that simply did not exist. He forced a sickeningly fake smile onto his face, a grotesque and trembling expression that completely failed to reach his terrified eyes. He took a hesitant, shaky step toward me. He raised his hands in a gesture of mock surrender, his palms facing outward as if trying to calm a wild animal. His voice dropped to a hushed, conspiratorial whisper, desperately attempting to create a bubble of privacy in a dining room where 50 people were currently hanging onto his every single breath. Amelia, please, Kendrick pleaded, his tone dripping with a sudden and repulsive familiarity. Let us not do this right here. Let us be adults about this situation. We are about to be family. Whatever Madison said earlier, whatever happened in the past between you two, we can absolutely move past it. I apologize for my comments. I was entirely out of line. Let us go to a private room, just the family, and we can resolve this internal matter quietly. I am certain we can come to a mutually beneficial arrangement. I let out a sharp, resonant laugh that cut violently through his pathetic plea. Family, I repeated. I projected my voice effortlessly, ensuring it bounced off the crystal chandeliers overhead and reached the very back of the restaurant. 10 minutes ago, I was a lowly wage earner, ruining your pristine aesthetic. You literally threw a credit card at my face and ordered me to crawl back to a cubicle. Do not dare invoke the word family, now that you realize I am the one holding the keys to your financial survival. Kendrick swallowed hard. Sweat was visibly beading on his forehead, catching the dim, ambient light of the room. Amelia, I am begging you. This is business. We can talk about the Series A term sheet in private. We are talking about it right now. I stated, my voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority, because I do not conduct venture capital due diligence in private when the founder has just publicly insulted my net worth and my intelligence. If you want to talk about your company, Kendrick, let us talk about it right here, in front of all these lovely investors you invited to impress tonight. I took a deliberate step forward, invading his physical space, just as he had invaded mine moments earlier. I did not need to consult any notes. I had memorized his entire disastrous financial portfolio during my morning review. You stand here bragging about disrupting the global digital payment ecosystem. I said, my words striking him with the force of physical blows. You talk about institutional wealth. But the unedited financial reports my analysts pulled yesterday tell a very different, very disturbing story. Let us talk about your burn rate, Kendrick. It is sitting at a catastrophic 80%. Kendrick flinched violently, as if I had struck him across the jaw. He opened his mouth to interrupt, to offer some desperate, fabricated spin, but I talked right over him with the commanding volume of an executive who was entirely used to silencing chaotic boardrooms. You raised $2 million in a seed round from a group of naive angel investors 9 months ago, I continued relentlessly. You projected a solid 2-year financial runway in your initial pitch. Yet your operational accounts are currently bleeding dry. You have less than 3 months of liquid cash left. And do you want to know why, Kendrick? It is not because you are investing in top-tier software engineering. It is not because of aggressive customer acquisition costs or building robust server infrastructure. I gestured dismissively toward his immaculate tailored clothing. It is because you are using investor capital as your personal piggy bank. That bespoke midnight blue Tom Ford suit you are wearing right now. My financial forensics team found it billed to your company under miscellaneous marketing expenses, the luxury loft you lease in the downtown financial district. It is classified as a corporate collaborative workspace to hide the fact that it is your personal apartment. And this incredibly lavish engagement dinner, complete with vintage Bordeaux wine and imported lobster for 50 people. I swept my arm across the room, encompassing the extravagant floral arrangements, the crystal glasses, and the stunned guests. I guarantee you expense this entire night to NovaPay as a networking event for potential stakeholders. You are committing blatant textbook fiduciary negligence. Stop, Kendrick gasped out. His hands were trembling so violently, he had to press them against his thighs to steady them. Please, you do not understand the optics required to build a luxury tech brand. I understand corporate fraud. I shot back, my voice as cold and unforgiving as liquid nitrogen. You are not a visionary tech founder. You are a con artist running a glorified Ponzi scheme to fund a billionaire lifestyle you cannot actually afford. You are bleeding your initial angel investors completely dry. And you honestly thought you could use Vanguard Ventures to plug the massive hemorrhaging hole in your balance sheet before the board of directors noticed the missing funds. The destruction of his ego was absolute and irreversible. The towering, arrogant tech bro who had commanded the room moments ago was completely gone. His broad shoulders slumped forward, his chest caved in. He looked like a hollow, terrified shell of a man staring directly at a prison sentence. Madison let out a high, thin wail of pure horror. The realization that she was not marrying a multimillionaire, but a broke criminal who was running out of stolen money hit her with devastating force. She dropped Kendrick's arm and stumbled backward, staring at him as if he were a stranger. Richard and Patricia looked like they were going to be physically sick. The wealthy golden son-in-law they had just bragged about was a complete illusion. Then a new sound began to fill the quiet restaurant. It was not the clinking of glasses or the hum of polite conversation. It was the synchronized electronic chiming of smartphone cameras. I glanced past Kendrick's defeated posture and saw the brutal reality of the digital age taking over. At the main tables, the high society guests were no longer just staring in shock. They had pulled out their phones. The bright, harsh glare of recording lights and the sudden rapid flashes of cameras illuminated the dim restaurant like a press conference. The venture capital contacts and elite friends Kendrick had invited to witness his grand triumph were now eagerly documenting his spectacular, catastrophic downfall. They were recording every single word of my financial dismantling. The video of the fake tech CEO being exposed for misappropriating funds was going to be circulating through the Silicon Valley and Chicago elite networks before the dessert course was even served. The pristine, carefully curated image of my family's upper-class perfection was being recorded and uploaded in real time, permanently tying them to a publicly disgraced fraudster. I looked back at Kendrick, watching the absolute last shred of his arrogant pride evaporate under the glaring lights of dozens of recording phones. "You wanted a captive audience tonight, Kendrick," I said softly, delivering the final sentence with chilling finality. "Now you have one. Enjoy the premiere." The flashing lights of the smartphone cameras illuminated the absolute terror on Kendrick's face. He stood paralyzed, stripped of his expensive facade, completely exposed to the very people he had tried so desperately to impress. He opened his mouth, perhaps to beg one last time, perhaps to offer another fabricated excuse, but his voice failed him entirely. I stepped even closer, my voice dropping to a register that was calm, clinical, and absolutely lethal. "I am officially rejecting your Series A funding application," I stated, making sure every syllable carried the heavy weight of a judge, delivering a final sentence. "Vanguard Ventures will not invest a single dollar into NovaPay, but my rejection is the absolute least of your concerns right now." Kendrick flinched, as if I had struck him across the face. He raised a trembling hand, but I did not pause to let him speak. "By tomorrow morning," I continued, my eyes locked onto his, I will be issuing a formal internal red flag memo across the entire Silicon Valley and Chicago venture capital networks. Every major fund, every angel syndicate, and every institutional investor will receive a highly detailed summary of your financial misconduct. They will see the exact burn rate you tried so hard to hide. They will see the fraudulent expense reports. They will know, without a shadow of a doubt, that you used investor capital to fund your luxury wardrobe and this ridiculous overpriced engagement dinner. I let a slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. You are completely radioactive, Kendrick. No reputable firm will ever let you past their lobby doors again. Your company is dead in the water. Enjoy your bankruptcy. The finality of my words hit him like a physical blow. The last remaining ounce of strength vanished from Kendrick's legs. He literally collapsed, his knees buckling beneath him. He hit the polished hardwood floor of the restaurant with a heavy thud, catching himself weakly on his hands and knees. He stared blankly at the expensive leather shoes he had bought with stolen money, gasping for air as a full-blown panic attack overtook him. The arrogant tech founder had been reduced to a gasping, ruined mess on the floor of a restaurant he could not even afford. A high-pitched, hysterical scream shattered the tense silence of the dining room. Madison snapped out of her state of shock. She looked down at the man kneeling on the floor, the man who was supposed to be her golden ticket to private jets and endless luxury. The realization that she was legally binding herself to a broke, soon-to-be blacklisted fraudster hit her with violent force. She grabbed the sides of her designer dress, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure desperation and rage. Dad Madison shrieked, spinning around to face Richard. Her voice was shrill, echoing painfully against the crystal chandeliers above us. "Dad, you have to fix this right now." Richard stood frozen, his face a sickly shade of gray. He was staring at Kendrick on the floor, utterly paralyzed by the rapid implosion of his high society dreams. "You promised me," Madison yelled, grabbing Richard by the lapels of his rented tuxedo and shaking him violently. "You told me that if his funding ever fell through, you would use the family real estate fund to save his company. You said you would pull the equity to ensure we had our startup capital. Do it now. Write him a check and get this miserable woman out of my restaurant." Patricia grabbed Madison's arm, trying to quiet her down, casting frantic glances at the wealthy guests who were still actively recording the entire meltdown. But Madison shoved her mother away, her entitlement completely overriding any sense of public shame or decorum. "Make her stop!" Madison screamed at Richard, pointing a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. "She is ruining my life. Cut the check for NovaPay right now." The sheer, unadulterated delusion of my sister's demand was almost comical. She actually believed our father possessed the kind of liquid capital required to bail out a failing tech startup. Richard's face rapidly transitioned from pale shock to a deep, violently furious crimson. The veins in his neck bulged aggressively against his tight collar. The humiliation of being exposed, coupled with Madison's screaming demands in front of 50 elite witnesses, finally pushed him over the edge. He could not attack Kendrick, and he could not silence Madison, so he turned his absolute blinding rage directly toward the easiest target. He turned toward me. Richard lunged forward, closing the distance between us in two heavy, aggressive strides. He stopped just inches from my face. He raised his right hand and pointed his index finger directly between my eyes, his entire arm shaking with violent fury. "You vindictive, ungrateful disgrace!" Richard roared, completely abandoning any remaining shred of his dignified patriarch persona. "You come into this venue, you humiliate your sister, and you intentionally destroy her future husband out of pure petty jealousy. You think because you sit in some fancy boardroom you can dictate how this family operates." I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, my face a mask of absolute indifference. I did not blink as his finger hovered dangerously close to my nose. "I am the head of this family," Richard bellowed, spit flying from his lips as he shouted. "And I am telling you right now that you have just crossed the point of no return. You are officially cut out. I am calling my attorneys the second this dinner is over. I am striking your name from every single legal document I own." He puffed out his chest, trying to weaponize the very wealth he had always used to control me. "You will not see a single dime of my estate," Richard threatened, his voice echoing fiercely through the quiet room. "You are completely disinherited. That Beverly Hills mansion, the vast property portfolio, the generational wealth I built with my bare hands, it is all going to Madison. You are getting absolutely nothing. I will leave you to rot in the street before I let you touch 1 cent of my legacy. You are dead to me, Amelia." He stood there breathing heavily, waiting for me to break. He waited for the familiar panic to wash over my face. He waited for the terrified, submissive daughter to emerge and beg for his financial forgiveness. He honestly believed that the threat of losing his imaginary Beverly Hills mansion would force me to my knees in front of the entire restaurant. Instead, I looked at him. I looked at the man who had allowed my mother to steal my identity, the man who had banished me to a bar stool, the man who was currently trying to intimidate a venture capitalist with entirely empty threats. I felt a cool, dangerous laugh rising in my chest. Richard had just played his absolute final card. He had threatened to take away everything he owned. He had no idea that I already knew exactly what his grand legacy was actually worth. Richard stood there with his chest puffed out to an almost comical degree. He was breathing heavily through his nose like a cornered bull. He truly believed he had just delivered the ultimate killing stroke. He looked around the silent dining room, his eyes scanning the tables of wealthy investors and elite socialites, desperately trying to gauge their reaction. He needed them to see him as a ruthless titan of industry. He needed them to believe that the catastrophic failure currently weeping on the floor was just a minor hiccup, and that the real power in the room belonged entirely to him. He raised his voice even louder, making sure the people recording on their smartphones captured every single syllable of his grand patriarch performance. "You will be erased from our history," Richard bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the restaurant. "Every trust fund, every offshore account, every single piece of real estate tied to our family name is officially off limits to you. I am going to call my wealth management team first thing Monday morning. I am instructing them to liquidate your designated shares and transfer every last penny directly into Madison's accounts. You think you are so powerful sitting in your little venture capital office? You have absolutely no idea what real generational wealth looks like." Patricia stepped up beside him, her posture suddenly rigid and proud. She adjusted her designer necklace, fully buying into the fantasy her husband was spinning. She looked at me with a gaze full of venomous pity. "You brought this on yourself, Amelia," Patricia stated, her voice trembling with manufactured righteousness. "We gave you every opportunity to be part of our elite circle. We offered you the world and you threw it back in our faces, out of pure bitter jealousy. You will spend the rest of your miserable life regretting the moment you tried to humiliate your sister. You are going to watch Madison build an empire from the outside looking in." Madison had stopped screaming at Kendrick long enough to absorb our parents' aggressive defense. A sickening, triumphant smirk began to creep back onto her tear-stained face. She wiped a smudge of expensive mascara from her cheek and stood a little taller. She honestly thought they had won. She actually believed that her father's booming voice and empty threats had somehow neutralized the fact that her fiancé was a fraud facing total financial ruin. The 50 guests in the room remained completely motionless. The camera flashes continued to pop, capturing the bizarre standoff. The tension was so thick it felt like physical pressure against my skin. They were all waiting for my reaction. They were waiting for my tough facade to crack under the weight of being publicly disowned from a massive family fortune. I stood perfectly still. I looked at my father's red, furious face. I looked at my mother's arrogant sneer. I looked at my sister's delusional, victorious smirk. And then I looked down at Kendrick, who was still kneeling on the hardwood floor, clutching his chest and gasping for air like a dying fish. I felt a strange sensation bubbling up in the back of my throat. It was not anger. It was not sorrow. It was not even indignation. It was pure, unadulterated hilarity. A soft chuckle escaped my lips. I tried to press my lips together to suppress it, but the sheer staggering absurdity of the situation was simply too much to contain. The chuckle grew into a distinct, audible laugh. Richard frowned, his thick eyebrows pulling together in deep confusion. He lowered his pointing finger just a fraction of an inch. My laughter grew louder. It was not a nervous laugh, and it certainly was not hysterical. It was a rich, full-throated sound of genuine amusement. I threw my head back and let the laughter wash over the dead, silent dining room. The sound bounced off the crystal chandeliers and echoed against the mahogany walls. It was bright and sharp, slicing through the heavy, suffocating tension like a freshly sharpened blade. Next to me, Isabella let out a soft, elegant laugh of her own, perfectly matching my energy. She picked up her martini glass and took a slow, relaxed sip, watching my family squirm under the weight of our shared amusement. Richard's face contorted. The violent crimson of his anger was rapidly being replaced by a sickly pale shade of profound uncertainty. The confident, booming patriarch persona he had just projected began to fracture and dissolve. He stared at me as if I had suddenly grown a second head. He could not comprehend what was happening. He had just threatened to take away millions of dollars, a Beverly Hills mansion, and a sprawling corporate empire. By all the laws of his superficial universe, I was supposed to be begging for mercy on my knees. "Stop laughing!" Richard demanded, his voice losing its booming authority and cracking slightly at the edges. "I am completely serious, Amelia. I am cutting you off forever. There is nothing funny about losing your entire inheritance." I could not stop. I literally had to place one hand on the polished surface of the bar to steady myself because I was laughing so hard my shoulders were shaking. I took a deep breath, trying to corral my amusement, wiping a single tear of mirth from the corner of my eye. Patricia stepped forward, her voice shrill and panicked. "Are you insane? Have you completely lost your mind? Your father just disowned you. He is taking away your future, and you are standing there laughing like a lunatic." The guests at the tables exchanged bewildered glances. The smartphones were still recording, capturing a scene that defied all logic. A father screaming about generational wealth. A golden child sister standing proudly beside a disgraced fraudster, and the outcast daughter laughing as if she were watching the greatest comedy routine ever written. I finally managed to catch my breath. I stood up straight, brushing an invisible speck of dust from the lapel of my charcoal blazer. The smile on my face was razor-sharp, radiating a terrifying level of control. I looked directly into my father's panicked, dilated eyes. I let the silence stretch out for a long, agonizing moment, ensuring that every single person in the room was hanging on to my next word. I looked at him with an expression of pure, devastating pity. He had spent his entire life wielding his finances like a weapon to keep me submissive. He had no idea that the gun he was pointing at me was not just empty, but completely imaginary. "Oh, Richard," I sighed, shaking my head slowly. The condescension in my voice was absolute. "You really should have checked your bank statements before you decided to give a speech about generational wealth. Let us talk about this grand, untouchable legacy you think you are taking away from me. Let us talk about exactly what you actually own." I did not break eye contact with my father as I reached down to the floor beside my bar stool. I picked up my structured leather briefcase. The heavy brass clasps clicked loudly in the dead, silent room. Richard watched my hands move, his previous bravado, suddenly replaced by a creeping, primal panic. He knew exactly what kind of documents a managing partner of a venture capital firm carried. He knew I did not bluff. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. I did not toss it carelessly. I placed it onto the mahogany bar with deliberate, punishing force. The heavy thud resonated across the entire dining room, cutting through the tension like a gunshot. I flipped the thick cover open, exposing the top document for everyone to see. Stamped across the upper right corner in glaring, undeniable red ink was the word "filed" alongside a federal court seal. "You are threatening to cut me out of your will," I said, making absolutely certain my voice carried to the investors, recording the scene at the back tables. You are threatening to take away the grand family estate and your vast corporate empire. Tell me the truth, Richard. Are you planning to leave me a massive pile of toxic debt? Because according to the federal bankruptcy court, that is absolutely the only thing you have left to your name. The color vanished from Richard's face so fast he looked as though he might physically collapse onto the floor. Patricia gripped the edge of the bar counter, her knuckles turning bone white, her mouth opening and closing in silent, suffocating horror. Madison stared at the folder, her eyes wide and unblinking, entirely unable to comprehend the words coming out of my mouth. Your primary holding company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Exactly 8 months ago, I announced. I projected the brutal facts, clearly shattering their pristine high society illusion into microscopic pieces. Your manufacturing plants were completely liquidated to pay off secured creditors. Your offshore accounts were frozen and seized. You do not have a generational wealth empire to pass down to Madison or anyone else. You have a staggering mountain of defaulted loans and a team of federal auditors breathing down your neck. A collective sharp gasp erupted from the 50 guests at the main tables. The elite venture capitalists and high society friends Madison had invited suddenly recoiled as if my parents were highly contagious. They were looking at Richard and Patricia not as respected peers, but as financial lepers. Furious murmurs swept through the room like a sudden storm. People were whispering, pointing, and eagerly zooming in their smartphone cameras to capture the bright red federal stamp on the documents resting on the bar. That is a lie, Madison shrieked, her voice cracking violently under the pressure. She let go of Kendrick and rushed toward the bar, staring down at the thick stack of legal papers. Dad, tell her she is lying right now. Tell them all she is just making this up to ruin my engagement dinner. We are wealthy. You just bought me a new sports car last month. You told me my trust fund was perfectly secure. I did not let Richard formulate a desperate lie. I picked up the top page of the docket and read directly from the federal filing. Case number 4, 28-90. I read, my tone clinically precise. Filed in the Central District of California. Listed corporate liabilities exceeding $40 million. Listed assets totaling less than $2 million. That new sports car is a short-term lease, Madison, and the dealership is currently looking to repossess it because the payments are 90 days past due. I know this because my financial analysts conduct highly thorough background checks on anyone associated with the founders pitching to my firm. When Kendrick submitted his application to Vanguard Ventures, my team flagged your entire family as a massive, catastrophic financial liability. Patricia let out a strangled, pathetic whimper. She brought both trembling hands to her face, desperately trying to hide from the glaring lights of the smartphone cameras pointed in her direction. The heavy, ostentatious diamond necklace she was wearing suddenly looked like cheap costume jewelry. She had spent her entire adult life judging others based on their net worth, stepping on anyone she deemed beneath her, and now her absolute lack of funds was public knowledge. Her carefully constructed aristocratic identity was burning to ash right before her eyes. Richard stood completely paralyzed. The powerful, booming patriarch, who had just threatened to erase me from history, was gone. In his place stood a deflated, broken man, trembling violently in a rented tuxedo. He could not deny the federal court documents resting on the mahogany wood. He could not scream his way out of a Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing. The elite facade he had maintained for decades had just been publicly and permanently executed. You thought you could intimidate me with money? I said, my tone laced with absolute unyielding disgust. You thought you could use your imaginary riches to force me to my knees and make me pay your restaurant bill. But you are running on empty fumes. You have been using maxed-out credit cards to buy groceries while pretending to be titans of industry in public. You are nothing but desperate frauds trying to scam your way into another wealthy circle to survive. I looked at Madison, who was shaking her head in rabid denial, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. You came to this restaurant tonight hoping Kendrick would secure his $10 million funding so you could quietly bleed his company dry. I continued, exposing the absolute core of their sinister plan. You thought you could use his startup capital to save yourselves from total ruin. You needed a rich son-in-law to pay off your federal debts. The crowd in the dining room erupted into loud, shocked conversations. The pieces of the puzzle were rapidly falling into place for everyone watching. They realized that this extravagant engagement dinner was not a celebration of love or family. It was a desperate high-stakes theatrical performance orchestrated by two sets of con artists colliding in spectacular fashion. Kendrick was faking his tech success to secure venture capital from me, and my parents were faking their generational wealth to secure Kendrick's non-existent fortune. It was a beautiful, catastrophic collision of mutual deception, and I was the one holding the spotlight. The absolute silence of my parents was their ultimate confession. They had no counterattack. They had no arrogant speeches left to give. They were utterly stripped bare, standing in front of the elite society they worshipped, exposed as penniless frauds. Richard stood there, his chest heaving irregularly, desperately trying to salvage a single scrap of his shattered dignity. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his eyes darting frantically around the silent restaurant. "The corporate restructuring means absolutely nothing," he stammered, his voice lacking all its previous thunder. "We still hold the Beverly Hills estate. That property alone has been the crown jewel of our family portfolio for decades. It is completely insulated from the business bankruptcy. You will never set foot on those grounds again, Amelia. That house is Madison's future, and it is entirely out of your reach." I looked at him with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. He was clinging to a phantom fortress, entirely unaware that the walls had already crumbled to dust around him. "The Beverly Hills mansion," I repeated slowly, letting the words roll off my tongue with deliberate mockery. I reached back into the heavy manila folder resting on the mahogany bar. "You mean the sprawling property located at 824 Oakmont Drive? The one with the imported Italian marble foyer and the infinity pool overlooking the canyon?" I pulled out a second stack of documents, these ones bound by a heavy black metal clip. I slid them across the polished wood, pushing them right next to the federal bankruptcy filing. "Did you actually think I would stop my financial background check at your corporate filings?" I asked, my voice ringing with lethal clarity. "Let us talk about your highly insulated family estate, Richard. The bank issued a formal notice of default on that property 10 months ago. You stopped paying the mortgage long before you even filed for Chapter 11. You ignored the warning letters. You ignored the phone calls from the bank. You just kept hosting your lavish dinner parties and buying designer clothes on credit, completely pretending that the bank was not actively preparing to seize the roof over your head." Patricia let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp. Her hands flew to her mouth, covering her lips. She looked at Richard with wide, terrified eyes, clearly realizing that the massive financial secret he had sworn to handle was now highly public knowledge. Madison shook her head frantically, refusing to look down at the heavy stack of documents on the bar, entirely paralyzed by the destruction of her pristine reality. "The bank officially foreclosed on the estate 4 months ago," I stated, delivering the brutal facts with the precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. "By all legal rights, the county sheriff should have arrived at your front door, changed all the locks, and thrown your designer luggage onto the street 90 days ago. You should be living out of a cheap motel right now." I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the cool mahogany bar, closing the physical distance between me and my father. His eyes were wide with a terror so raw and unfiltered it was almost difficult to witness. "Do you want to know why you are still sleeping in that house, Richard?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate register that commanded the attention of everyone in the room. "Do you want to know why the eviction notice never arrived at your front door?" He could not speak. He just stared at me, his face slick with cold sweat, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly. "Because my venture capital firm operates a secondary asset management company that specializes in purchasing distressed luxury debt," I revealed. The absolute truth hit the room like a physical shockwave. "When the bank auctioned off your defaulted mortgage, my firm bought it for pennies on the dollar. I own the debt. I own the deed. I own the absolute legal right to evict you at any given second. The only reason you are not completely homeless right now is because I placed a temporary administrative hold on the eviction process. You are living in a house that currently belongs to the very daughter you just tried to disown. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. The sheer, overwhelming scale of my financial dominance had entirely paralyzed them. Richard's jaw slacked in complete disbelief. Patricia was openly weeping now, her heavy tears completely ruining her expensive, carefully applied makeup. They had tried to banish me from their elite world, completely unaware that I was the one holding the legal deed to their entire existence. I stood up straight, shifting my gaze from my broken parents to the man struggling on the floor. Kendrick had managed to push himself up onto one knee. He was breathing heavily, his custom Tom Ford suit hopelessly wrinkled and disheveled. He looked at my parents, then looked at the foreclosure documents resting on the bar counter. This entire engagement is a masterpiece of mutual deception, I announced, projecting my voice so every single guest and investor could hear the final, devastating verdict. Look at this beautiful, pathetic stage play you have all put on tonight. My parents are drowning in massive federal debt using maxed-out credit cards and the fragile illusion of a Beverly Hills mansion to trap a wealthy tech founder. They desperately needed Kendrick's imaginary Silicon Valley millions to save them from total financial ruin. I pointed directly at Kendrick, who was now staring at Richard with a look of dawning visceral horror. And Kendrick, I continued pacing my words perfectly, is a desperate fraud burning through stolen investor capital, faking a billionaire lifestyle to trap a high society family. He desperately needed the illusion of your generational wealth to act as a financial safety net when his startup inevitably crashed and burned. You are two sets of desperate broke con artists actively trying to scam each other out of money that simply does not exist. It is an absolutely perfect tragedy. The wealthy investors at the back tables erupted into furious whispers. The elite guests Madison had invited to witness her grand triumph were now staring at her with pure, unfiltered disgust. The entire room finally understood the spectacular, hollow scam playing out before them. Kendrick slowly dragged himself up from the floor. He ignored my presence entirely. He turned his head with a slow, mechanical stiffness, his dark eyes locking onto Richard and Patricia. The arrogant, charming tech bro persona was completely vaporized. In its place was a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. His jaw clenched so tightly, the muscles fluttered visibly under his skin. He realized in that exact moment that there was absolutely no safety net. There was no family trust fund to bail out his failing company. He was not marrying into a powerful dynasty that could secure his future and pay off his furious angel investors. He was tying himself to a massive anchor made of federal debt, unpaid mortgages, and impending homelessness. He slowly turned his head to look at Madison, the woman he had just paraded around the room as his ultimate golden trophy, and his eyes filled with a terrifying, venomous rage. Kendrick stared at the federal bankruptcy documents resting on the mahogany bar. For a few agonizing seconds, his brain seemed incapable of processing the catastrophic reality unfolding before him. Then a violent tremor racked his entire body. The perfectly manicured tech founder persona, shattered, completely replaced by the raw, unhinged panic of a cornered animal. He slowly turned his head away from the bar and locked his eyes onto my father. His dark eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with an explosive, venomous hatred. He took a heavy, aggressive step toward Richard. His fists were clenched so tightly at his sides that his knuckles looked like polished marble. "You lied to me," Kendrick growled. His voice started as a low, dangerous rumble before rapidly escalating into a deafening roar. "You absolutely lied to my face, Richard." Richard backed up instinctively. The older man stumbled, his spine hitting the hard wooden edge of a nearby dining chair. There was nowhere left for him to retreat. Patricia shrank behind her husband, her hands covering her mouth to stifle her own pathetic sobbing. "You sat in my corporate office and promised me a bridge loan," Kendrick shouted, stepping fully into Richard's personal space. He did not care that 50 wealthy investors were actively recording every single second of this meltdown. He was completely untethered. You looked me dead in the eye and guaranteed that if Vanguard Ventures fell through, the Wilson Family Trust would cover my operational costs. You told me you had $50 million in liquid assets ready to deploy at a moment's notice. Richard held up his trembling hands in a desperate, weak attempt to pacify the younger man. Kendrick, please, you have to listen to me. Richard stammered, his voice cracking pitifully. We intended to help you. We just ran into a temporary liquidity issue with the overseas accounts. We can still leverage our remaining contacts. Liquidity issue. Kendrick spat the words out like they were toxic poison. He let out a harsh, barking laugh that held absolutely no humor. You are broke, Richard. You are a bankrupt, pathetic old man who cannot even afford the mortgage on his own house. You are living on borrowed time and stolen credit. You are nothing but cheap, low-level scammers playing dress-up in rented tuxedos. Madison threw herself forward. She could not accept that her golden ticket was evaporating in front of her eyes. She lunged at Kendrick and wrapped both of her arms desperately around his bicep. She pressed her tear-streaked, makeup-stained face against the lapel of his custom Tom Ford jacket, sobbing uncontrollably. Baby, please, Madison wailed, her voice shrill and grating with raw panic. Please stop doing this right now. We love each other. We can figure this out together. My parents will fix this. Dad always fixes this. We can just scale back the wedding and start over. Kendrick looked down at Madison with an expression of profound, unfiltered revulsion. It was the look a person gives to a rotting piece of garbage found on the sidewalk. He grabbed her wrists with rough, merciless force and violently ripped her hands off his arm. He shoved her backward so hard she stumbled. Her high heels skidded against the polished hardwood floor, and she nearly collapsed into a nearby table. Do not touch me! Kendrick yelled, his voice echoing fiercely against the crystal chandeliers. Are you completely delusional, Madison? Build our own life. With what money? My company is bleeding cash. I needed a family that could actually back me financially. I needed a corporate dynasty that could open doors and sign massive checks. I did not sign up to marry into a family of freeloading beggars who are about to be thrown out onto the street by their own sister. Patricia rushed forward, tears streaming endlessly down her pale cheeks. She reached out her hands, shaking violently, trying to touch Kendrick's shoulder in a desperate bid to calm him down. Kendrick, please keep your voice down, Patricia pleaded, her voice a high-pitched whine. The guests are watching us. We can go to a private room right now. We can call our lawyers and arrange a restructuring plan. We still have powerful connections in this city. Kendrick violently swatted Patricia's hand away before she could even make contact. The sharp slapping sound of his hand hitting hers echoed loudly through the silent restaurant. Patricia gasped in shock, clutching her wrist against her chest, staring at him as if he were a monster. Keep my voice down, Kendrick roared, pacing back and forth like a caged predator. You want me to worry about the guests? Half the people in this room are my investors, Patricia. They just heard your daughter announce that I am a fraud, and they just found out that my future in-laws are currently facing federal bankruptcy and eviction. My entire professional reputation is completely incinerated because I tied myself to your pathetic sinking ship. He turned back to Richard, his chest heaving with rage. You used me, Kendrick snarled, leaning aggressively into Richard's face. You brought me to your exclusive country club. You introduced me to your golf buddies. You paraded me around like I was the final piece of your grand financial puzzle. You needed my tech CEO status to legitimize your fake wealth. You were using my startup to mask the fact that you are a total financial failure. You are a parasite, Richard. Madison was sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. The heavy mascara she had spent hours applying was running down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks, ruining her pristine image. She reached out for Kendrick again, her fingers grasping at the empty air between them. You cannot just leave me like this, Madison cried out, her voice cracking with raw desperation. We are supposed to get married. Everyone is expecting a wedding. You promised me a life together. Kendrick looked at Madison, his eyes sweeping over her designer dress and her expensive jewelry, knowing now that every single item she wore was purchased on fraudulent credit. Love Kendrick mocked the word, tasting like ash in his mouth. You think I give a single damn about love right now? I needed Capital Madison. I needed a safety net. I needed a family that could write a $10 million check without blinking. You brought me nothing but a mountain of federal debt and a sister who holds the absolute legal right to destroy my entire life. He threw his hands up in the air, completely losing his grip on reality. I am the laughingstock of the entire financial district, he shouted to the ceiling. I am standing in a restaurant I cannot afford to pay for, engaged to a woman who is about to be homeless, surrounded by venture capitalists who will never answer my phone calls again. You ruined me. You absolutely ruined me. Richard tried to muster one final pathetic ounce of authority. He stood up straight, though his knees were visibly shaking. Kendrick, you need to calm down immediately. This behavior is entirely unacceptable. We are still your family. You are nothing to me. Kendrick roared, cutting Richard off with brutal force. You are not my family. You are a financial liability. You are a toxic asset. I would rather sleep on the actual street than tie my name to a family of broke, desperate imposters. He turned his back on them entirely in a gesture of absolute final rejection. He stood in the center of the room, breathing heavily, completely surrounded by the wreckage of his own arrogant ambitions and my family's spectacular lies. I sat quietly at the bar next to Isabella, watching the entire glorious implosion play out exactly as I had orchestrated. The golden child was weeping on the floor, the patriarchal tyrant was cowering against a chair, and the arrogant tech founder was having a public nervous breakdown. It was a masterpiece of self-destruction, and they were executing it flawlessly without me having to lift a single finger. Kendrick stood in the center of the dining room, his chest heaving as he stared at the absolute wreckage of his future. The furious adrenaline that had fueled his screaming match with Richard was rapidly mutating into a cold, venomous disgust. He turned his dark, bloodshot eyes back to Madison. She was still reaching out to him, her hands trembling violently in the air between them. The bright, harsh lighting of the crystal chandeliers caught the massive diamond engagement ring sitting heavily on Madison's left hand. The stones sparkled with a blinding, mocking brilliance. It was the ultimate symbol of their shared delusion. It was the prop they had used to convince everyone in this room that they were a match made in Silicon Valley heaven. Kendrick locked his eyes onto that diamond. His jaw tightened so fiercely that the muscles in his cheeks twitched. He closed the short distance between them with a sudden predatory quickness. Madison let out a tiny gasp of relief, clearly mistaking his approach for a gesture of reconciliation. She foolishly leaned forward, ready to bury her tear-stained face into his expensive jacket. Instead of embracing her, Kendrick reached out and grabbed her left wrist. His grip was brutal and entirely devoid of affection. Madison let out a sharp cry of pain, her eyes widening in pure shock. Patricia shrieked from the sidelines, begging him to let her daughter go, but Richard remained completely paralyzed, absolutely powerless to intervene in the execution happening right in front of him. Kendrick did not loosen his grip. With his free hand, he grabbed the massive diamond ring. He pulled it viciously, sliding the heavy metal over her knuckle with a harsh, unyielding force. Madison whimpered as the ring scraped against her skin, but Kendrick showed absolutely no mercy. He ripped the engagement ring completely off her finger. He held the sparkling jewelry up in the air, dangling it between his thumb and forefinger for the entire restaurant to see. The 50 guests at the main tables immediately raised their smartphones higher, making sure their camera lenses were perfectly focused on the glittering stone. You loved showing this off to your elite country club friends. Kendrick snarled, his voice vibrating with pure, unfiltered malice. You loved parading this rock around Chicago, acting like you had secured a billionaire tech founder. You thought this diamond proved you were superior to everyone else in this room. You thought it proved you were better than your sister. Kendrick let out a harsh, barking laugh that chilled the blood in my veins. Let me tell you the absolute truth about this ring, Madison, he announced, projecting his voice loudly so every single investor and high society guest could hear the humiliating reality. This ring is a complete fraud, just like you. I did not buy this with liquid capital. I financed this rock on a 36-month installment plan with a predatory interest rate just to shut you up. I went into massive personal debt to buy a prop that would fit the fake billionaire narrative you demanded. And now I find out I bought it for a woman who does not even have a real trust fund. Madison shook her head frantically. Tears poured down her face, ruining her meticulous makeup, leaving dark, ugly streaks across her cheeks. She held her bare hand against her chest, looking at Kendrick as if he had just driven a knife straight into her heart. "You are nothing but a pathetic failed gold digger," Kendrick shouted, his voice echoing violently across the dining room. "You tried to mine a fortune that did not exist, and you used me as your personal shovel. You have absolutely nothing to offer. Your European vacations, your designer clothes, your entire glamorous lifestyle was bought with your sister's stolen identity. You are a parasite wearing stolen goods, and I am cutting you off right now." With a sharp, violent flick of his wrist, Kendrick hurled the heavy diamond ring directly at Madison's face. The heavy metal struck her squarely on the cheekbone with a loud, sickening crack. Madison cried out in pain, her hands flying up to cover her face. The ring bounced off her skin and hit the polished hardwood floor, clattering loudly as it spun across the room, finally coming to a rest near the pristine shoes of a horrified venture capitalist. "There is no wedding," Kendrick roared, delivering the final definitive death blow to their relationship. "The engagement is entirely cancelled. We are completely done. Do not call me. Do not text me. If you or your broke, fraudulent parents ever try to contact me again, I will file a restraining order so fast it will make your head spin." The brutal finality of his words broke the very last thread holding Madison together. Her knees buckled violently beneath her. She collapsed completely, hitting the hardwood floor in a heap of expensive, ruined fabric. She curled into a tight ball, pressing her face against the cold wood, and let out a guttural, agonizing wail. It was the sound of a spoiled, entitled golden child experiencing true, irreversible destruction for the very first time in her life. Patricia dropped to her knees beside her weeping daughter. She threw her arms around Madison, sobbing just as hysterically, her own high society facade completely vaporized. They knelt together on the floor of the upscale restaurant, two miserable women crying over a shattered illusion of wealth. Richard stood directly above them, his shoulders slumped, his eyes vacant and dead. The powerful patriarch was reduced to a pathetic bystander, watching his family burn to ash. The guests were absolutely ruthless. Nobody stepped forward to offer a napkin or a hand of support. The elite crowd simply stood in a wide circle around the sobbing women, their smartphones recording every single second of the spectacular meltdown. The camera flashes fired like strobe lights, capturing the ruined makeup, the torn dignity, and the sheer pathetic desperation of the Wilson family. The perfect family image had officially exploded, and the digital footprint of their catastrophic failure was already being uploaded to the internet in real time. I sat at the bar watching the chaotic scene unfold with absolute freezing calm. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the urge to intervene. They had built their entire existence on lies, theft, and extreme cruelty, and now gravity had simply returned to collect its debt. Isabella rested her hand gently over mine on the mahogany counter. She took a slow sip of her martini, her emerald eyes watching the glorious, catastrophic implosion of the people who had tried to bury me. The execution was flawless. Kendrick turned his back on the weeping women and stormed toward the exit. He adjusted his ruined jacket, trying to salvage a microscopic shred of dignity as he marched past the staring investors. He wanted to escape the suffocating humiliation, to run out into the cold night air and disappear from the catastrophic wreckage of his own making. But he did not make it to the polished glass doors. A tall, impeccably dressed restaurant manager, flanked by two massive security guards, stepped directly into his path. The manager held the black leather folio containing the $2,800 bill. Kendrick tried to push past them, barking an aggressive order to move out of his way. The security guards did not flinch. They simply crossed their thick arms, forming an impenetrable human wall that blocked the only exit. The manager extended the folio toward Kendrick. His voice was polite, incredibly firm, and laced with absolute steel. He informed Kendrick that the restaurant required immediate payment before any host or guest of honor vacated the premises. Kendrick snatched his heavy platinum card off the bar counter where he had thrown it earlier. He shoved the metal card into the manager's mobile payment terminal with violent, aggressive force. He glared at the manager, his chest heaving, waiting for the transaction to clear so he could finally escape this nightmare. The digital machine processed for a tense, silent moment. Then a sharp, angry beep echoed through the quiet room. The screen flashed bright red. Declined. Kendrick's face contorted in disbelief. He ripped the metal card out and jammed it back into the reader. He pressed the buttons with shaking fingers, muttering under his breath. The machine processed again. Another sharp beep rang out. Declined. He began cursing loudly, ripping his leather wallet from his inner pocket. He pulled out a gold corporate card and handed it to the manager. The manager swiped it. Declined. Kendrick stared at the glowing red screen of the terminal as if it were a physical impossibility. He started screaming at the manager, blaming the machine, blaming the restaurant's network, frantically claiming that he had millions in liquid capital sitting in his accounts. From my seat at the bar, I projected my voice effortlessly over his pathetic commotion. "Your machine is working perfectly fine," I announced, ensuring my voice carried to the wealthy guests recording the scene. "The issue is not the network. The issue is that exactly 20 minutes ago, I authorized my compliance team to initiate an emergency freeze on all accounts associated with NovaPay. Pending a comprehensive federal fraud audit by Vanguard Ventures, every single line of corporate credit and linked personal account attached to your name is officially locked." Kendrick snapped his head toward me, his eyes wide with absolute terror. "You are completely cut off from your stolen funds, Kendrick," I stated with a cold, unforgiving smile. "You do not have a single working piece of plastic to your name. You cannot even afford a taxi ride home." Kendrick dropped his wallet onto the floor in pure, paralyzing defeat. The heavy silence of the room swallowed his arrogant pride entirely. The manager immediately pivoted his attention away from the ruined tech founder. He turned his sharp gaze directly to Richard and Patricia. As the official hosts of this lavish engagement dinner, the immense financial burden legally fell onto their shoulders. "Sir, Madam," the manager said, stepping toward my parents, "the balance of $2,800 remains outstanding. We require an alternative method of payment immediately." Richard scrambled like a cornered rat. His hands were shaking violently as he pulled out his own leather wallet. Patricia dug frantically through her designer knockoff purse, her breath hitching in raw, unfiltered panic. The high society mask was entirely gone, replaced by the terrified franticness of two con artists caught red-handed. They produced a handful of credit cards, tossing them onto the silver tray the manager presented. The manager picked up the first card and ran it through the terminal. Declined. He picked up the second card. Declined. A third card followed, then a fourth. Every single piece of plastic they owned flashed the exact same bright red error message. Their credit limits were completely exhausted. The federal bankruptcy had swallowed their real assets, and their secret fraudulent identity theft reserves were entirely drained. They were running on absolute fumes, and the engine had just violently stalled. The illusion was dead, and the bill remained unpaid. The wealthy guests at the main tables began to whisper and point. The elite investors Kendrick had brought were watching my parents fail to produce even a fraction of the bill they had just racked up. Panic mutated into aggressive defensive entitlement. Richard puffed out his chest, stepping dangerously into the manager's personal space. He started screaming about customer service and blatant disrespect. He demanded to know how dare they embarrass a family of such high standing. Patricia joined in, her voice shrill and hysterical, threatening to ruin the restaurant's reputation. She pointed her shaking finger at the security guards, claiming they were elite patrons who would ensure this establishment went completely out of business by tomorrow morning. "Do you know who we are?" Richard bellowed, spit flying from his lips. "We demand to speak to the owner of this establishment immediately. I will have your job for this insolence. I will file a massive lawsuit for public defamation. Bring me the owner right now." They created an ugly, chaotic, and desperately pathetic scene in the middle of the high society dining room. They were trying to scream their way out of a debt they could not pay. Isabella placed her martini glass onto the cardboard coaster with a definitive sharp click. She stood up from her bar stool. Her emerald gown caught the light of the chandeliers, making her look like a force of absolute nature. She moved with the predatory, effortless grace of royalty. She walked right into the center of the screaming match, stepping directly between the flustered manager and my red-faced shouting parents. She looked at Richard and Patricia with an expression of absolute freezing disdain. She did not yell. She did not raise her voice. She delivered her final sentence with an earth-shattering authority that silenced the entire room in a fraction of a second. "Do not raise your voice in my family's restaurant." Richard froze mid-sentence. His mouth hung open, but the aggressive threats died instantly in his throat. Patricia took a staggering step backward, her eyes darting between my perfectly composed girlfriend and the towering security guards flanking her. Isabella stepped fully into the light of the grand chandelier, projecting an aura of absolute, undisputed power. "You demanded to speak to the owner," Isabella stated, her voice echoing with crystalline clarity. "You are speaking to her. El Ora is the flagship dining establishment of my family's international hospitality group. We own this building. We own the property it sits on. And we do not tolerate petty scam artists screaming at our staff when their fraudulent credit cards inevitably decline." The entire dining room collectively gasped. The 50 elite guests who had been actively recording Kendrick's downfall and my parents' financial ruin eagerly pivoted their smartphone cameras toward Isabella. They recognized her name. They recognized the generational wealth and true power she represented. Isabella turned her sharp gaze to the restaurant manager. Her instructions were delivered with chilling efficiency. "Lock the main doors," Isabella ordered. "Do not let anyone from this host family leave the premises. If they cannot produce $2,800 in verifiable funds within the next 5 minutes, call the Chicago Police Department. I want them arrested and formally charged with theft of services and defrauding a commercial establishment." "Yes, madam," the manager replied immediately. He signaled to the security guards, who instantly shifted their stance, forming an impenetrable human barricade across the exit. The reality of the situation hit my parents with the force of a swinging anvil. There was no escaping this. They could not bluff their way out of a police escort. They could not scream at the authorities like they screamed at the waitstaff. If the police arrived, their federal bankruptcy status, their maxed-out credit cards, and their history of identity theft would be pulled directly into a criminal investigation. They were staring down the barrel of actual jail time. Richard's face drained of the angry crimson, turning a sickening translucent gray. His broad shoulders collapsed inward. The imposing patriarch, who had spent the entire evening threatening to disinherit me, was completely gone. In his place stood a terrified, trembling old man who realized he was entirely out of options. Patricia began to hyperventilate. Her chest heaved wildly under her cheap designer knockoff dress. She looked around the room, making eye contact with the wealthy friends and country club associates she had invited to witness her daughter's grand engagement. Instead of sympathy, she saw only disgust and morbid fascination. They were watching her drown, and absolutely no one was throwing a life preserver. Madison, who was still crumpled on the hardwood floor where Kendrick had left her, let out a high-pitched wail. She scrambled up onto her knees, her expensive gown dragging across the spilled water and discarded napkins. The realization that she was about to be handcuffed and dragged out of her own engagement party in front of Chicago's elite society utterly broke her. They had absolutely nowhere left to turn. Their rich son-in-law was a fraud. Their credit was destroyed. Their social standing was incinerated. They had exactly one lifeline remaining in the entire world. Slowly, simultaneously, all three of them turned their heads to look at me. I remained standing near the mahogany bar, my posture relaxed, my expression completely unreadable. I watched the profound, humiliating shift in their demeanor. The sheer desperation radiating from them was palpable. Richard took a shaky, hesitant step in my direction. His hands were clasped together in front of his chest. "Amelia." He rasped, his voice cracking pitifully. "Amelia, please." He did not order me. He did not threaten me. He begged. Patricia did not even try to maintain her dignity. She practically crawled across the polished floor. She closed the distance between the main dining area and the bar, dropping heavily onto both of her knees right at my feet. The loud thud of her kneecaps hitting the hardwood echoed through the silent room. She reached out with trembling, sweaty hands and frantically grabbed the hem of my charcoal blazer. "Please, Amelia." Patricia sobbed, her face completely distorted by raw terror and ruin. "You cannot let them arrest us. You cannot let them take your father and me to jail over a restaurant bill. You have the money. You have millions of dollars. 2,800 is absolute pocket change for a woman in your position. I am begging you. Save us." Madison crawled over and joined her mother on the floor. The golden child, the sister who had just 30 minutes ago laughed into a microphone and told me I was an unwanted failure, was now kneeling at my feet, her face stained with black mascara and tears. "Amelia, please help us," Madison wailed, clinging to my pant leg like a desperate child. "Kendrick ruined everything. He lied to us. We have absolutely nothing left. If the police come, it will be on the news. My life will be completely over. You are my big sister. You have to protect me." Richard dropped to his knees right beside them. The three people who had spent my entire life making me feel small, worthless, and inadequate were now literally groveling on the floor of a restaurant, looking up at me as if I were a god who held their salvation. "We are your family," Richard pleaded, tears welling up in his desperate eyes. "We share the same blood, Amelia. You cannot turn your back on your own flesh and blood. Whatever mistakes we made in the past, whatever harsh words were spoken tonight, you have to find it in your heart to forgive us. Family protects family. You are the only one who can fix this. We need you." I looked down at the pathetic, weeping pile of people at my feet. The contrast between their current state and their previous arrogance was staggering. They were crying about blood. They were crying about family. They were using the exact same manipulative words they had always used to guilt me into submission, hoping that the ghost of the scared, desperate girl they used to control would somehow resurface and bail them out one last time. I did not pull away from their grasping hands immediately. I stood perfectly still, letting the cameras of 50 wealthy guests record the definitive, absolute submission of the Wilson family. I let the silence hang over them, forcing them to feel the agonizing weight of their humiliation. They were begging for a handout from the very woman they had tried to bury alive. The execution was complete. The stage was set for the final verdict. I looked down at my mother's grasping fingers, then back up to Isabella, who gave me a single confirming nod. It was time to deliver the final blow. I looked down at the hands frantically gripping my clothes. Patricia's manicured fingers were digging into the charcoal fabric of my blazer. Madison was clutching my pant leg as if her entire life depended on my mercy. Richard was kneeling with his hands clasped together in a pathetic prayer. These were the same people who had confidently banished me to a bar stool less than 2 hours ago. These were the people who had spent my entire childhood making me feel invisible and my entire adulthood trying to make me feel worthless. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. My heart was completely steady. I reached down and firmly grasped Patricia's wrist. I pried her fingers off my blazer, peeling her hand away with a slow, mechanical precision. She let out a fresh sob, reaching for me again, but I took a deliberate step backward, forcing her hand to drop to the hardwood floor. I looked down at Madison and gently kicked my foot back, dislodging her desperate grip from my ankle. She crumpled forward, burying her face in her hands. "You want to talk about blood?" I said, my voice cutting through the sounds of their weeping. I projected my words clearly, making certain that every wealthy investor and socialite in the room recorded my final verdict. "You want to invoke the concept of family now that you are staring down a police escort and federal fraud charges." I looked directly at Richard. His eyes were wide with pure terror. You use the word family as a weapon, Richard. I continued, my tone devoid of any warmth. You use it as a leash to control people. When you needed to fund Madison's luxury vacations, family meant stealing my identity and ruining my credit. When you needed a scapegoat for your own insecurities, family meant mocking my career and isolating me from your perfect upper-class image. You only remember that we share the same blood when you need someone to absorb the consequences of your catastrophic failures. Patricia looked up at me, her face a ruined mess of expensive cosmetics and genuine panic. "Amelia, please," she begged, her voice a high-pitched, grating whine. "We made mistakes. We were wrong. We are so incredibly sorry. Just pay the restaurant. We will do whatever you want. We will make it up to you." I shook my head slowly, looking down at the woman who had birthed me, but had never been a mother to me. "You are not sorry for what you did, Patricia," I stated with absolute clarity. "You are only sorry that you finally got caught. You are sorry that your elite friends are watching you grovel on the floor. You are sorry that you cannot manipulate your way out of a criminal charge. If Kendrick's credit card had cleared tonight, you would have spent the rest of the evening laughing at me from your reserved table. You would have gone home to the Beverly Hills mansion you do not even own, completely satisfied that you had put the family failure back in her place." I turned my gaze to Madison. The golden child was shivering violently on the floor, surrounded by the wreckage of her fake engagement and her shattered superiority complex. She had spent her entire life stepping on my shoulders to elevate herself, and now there was absolutely nothing beneath her feet. I took a deep breath, letting the cool, conditioned air of the restaurant fill my lungs. The moment of absolute closure had arrived. I looked at the three of them kneeling at my feet, and I delivered the final unyielding truth they needed to hear. "DNA does not make a family," I announced. My voice was calm, powerful, and utterly final. "Sharing genetics does not entitle you to my loyalty, my money, or my mercy. Respect creates a family. Trust creates a family. When I was at the absolute bottom, suffocating under the weight of the debt you stole in my name, you trampled me without a single second of hesitation. You laughed while I bled. Now that I am at the very top, holding the keys to an empire you could only dream of, you do not have the right to reach for me. You have absolutely no place in my world." I did not wait for their response. I did not care to hear another fabricated apology or another desperate plea for financial salvation. I turned my back on them completely. Isabella stepped forward. She did not look at my parents or my sister. She simply held out her arm. I linked my arm through hers, matching her flawless, elegant posture. We turned our backs on the weeping, ruined imposters on the floor and began to walk toward the exit. The crowd of 50 elite guests parted for us like the Red Sea. Venture capitalists, tech founders, and high society socialites silently stepped aside, lowering their phones to let us pass. They looked at me with a mixture of profound awe and absolute respect. I was no longer the uninvited sister relegated to the shadows. I was the undisputed force of nature who had just executed a flawless corporate and personal takeover. The restaurant manager gave a swift, respectful bow of his head as Isabella and I approached the front entrance. The two massive security guards stepped back, holding the heavy glass doors wide open for us. As we crossed the threshold, the frantic, chaotic sounds of the dining room began to fade. I could still hear Madison screaming my name. I could hear Patricia sobbing uncontrollably, begging the security guards not to call the authorities. But those sounds were rapidly being drowned out by a new, distinct noise cutting through the city streets. In the distance, the sharp, rising wail of Chicago police sirens pierced the night air. The flashing red and blue lights were already reflecting off the tall glass buildings, speeding directly toward the restaurant to collect three desperate con artists who could not pay their tab. The heavy glass doors of El Ora swung shut behind us with a solid, definitive click. The screaming was instantly cut off. The panic, the manipulation, and the toxic history were permanently sealed inside that building. I stepped out onto the sidewalk. The crisp, cool night air hit my face, clean and incredibly refreshing. The city lights glittered around us, illuminating a world of endless, unburdened possibilities. I looked at Isabella, who squeezed my arm and flashed a brilliant, victorious smile. I smiled back, a genuine expression of pure, unadulterated joy. I had walked into that restaurant as a ghost from their past, and I was walking out as the absolute master of my own future. I left the wreckage behind me, stepping forward into the beautiful, quiet night, completely untouchable and entirely free. The most powerful lesson we can take away from this story is that shared DNA does not automatically earn someone a permanent place in your life. Society constantly conditions us to believe that we must forgive, accommodate, and endure toxic behavior simply because it comes from our parents or siblings. But true family is built on a foundation of mutual respect, support, and unconditional love, not manipulation and financial exploitation. When people use you as a stepping stone to elevate their own fragile egos, their judgment of your worth is completely invalid. Amelia was treated like a failure, not because she actually lacked potential, but because her family desperately needed a scapegoat to hide their own catastrophic shortcomings. Toxic people will always try to keep you trapped in a narrative that makes them look superior. The ultimate victory against this kind of abuse does not come from screaming matches or begging for validation that they are fundamentally incapable of giving. Real power comes from walking away and building your own unbreakable empire. It comes from achieving absolute emotional and financial independence. You do not need to actively seek revenge against those who betrayed you. As we saw tonight, when you simply stop saving toxic people from their own destructive choices, their elaborate web of lies will eventually collapse and crush them under its own weight. You owe nothing to the people who smiled while you suffered. Your only obligation is to your own peace, your own boundaries, and the beautiful future you build with the people who actually value your presence. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own story of breaking free in the comments below.